It's recording.
Hi, I'm James King.
Hi, I'm Trent Moody.
And we're here to talk to you today about it's a war!
Oh yeah!
Yeah, the Russo-Japanese War! We are here today for Dr. Helen Kaibara's Digital Humanities Project for,
her historian's craft class.
That's right, so... Well, now what?
Let's get down to business.
To defeat the Russians.
In the late 19th century, Japan had become a force to be reckoned with. They had already defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki, Japan gained control of both Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula. Unfortunately, Russia, Germany, and France prevented Japan from taking the Liaodong Peninsula.
They suck!
Well, let's not pick sides. Okay. The Triple Intervention, so it is called, prevented Japan from seizing a very important piece of land, the aforementioned Liaodong Peninsula. This Liaodong Peninsula is important because of Japan's doctrine of imperialism, because all the cool kids were doing it. Much to the dismay of Japan, instead of them getting the Liaodong Peninsula, it was occupied by Russia.
That's this!
It is. It is that, indeed. More specifically, the Russians wanted Port Arthur.
Oh! I know this one! That's that!
It is that. Port Arthur is important because it's a warm water port, because Russian ports are cold water ports, and ports are not really good when they get frozen over in the winter.
They just have bears and ice!
They did. Not only was Japan humiliated by the Port Arthur situation, they were further angered by Russia occupying Manchuria after the Boxer Rebellion. They wanted revenge, and they soon would have it.
What are we gonna do with this like?
They did have their revenge.
1 year later!
On February 8th, 1904.
What happened?
Well, the Japanese would pull a sneak attack in the Korea Bay against the Russian fleet stationed at Port Arthur. And then the war began.
It's my turn! Okay! So, the Japanese Navy, right? They were really well trained. We're talking like, these were some of the most well-trained sailors that had ever sailed the seven seas in 1904. Russians, they just weren't ready. You know, I feel like at this point, we should probably step back and take a look at the map. Now listen, the Russians were kind of far from home. While they may seem geographically fairly close, to get to Korea, they had to pass by something very important, something very angry, something very powerful. Japan! It was right there! There's Port Arthur! Oh, and Russia, that was all the way up here. In fact, so far, up here, it was off the map. Anyway, moving along. Oh, by the way, this is the Tsushima Strait, where all the Russian ships had to come through. We'll get back to that. Moving along. So, one of the things that this conflict was most well known for was the fact that it was the very first, or considered to be the very first modern naval conflict. When we think of naval conflicts, right, of the 1800s or early 1900s, we think of like big wooden ships with big masts, giving broadsides and fighting the good fight. No, it wasn't like that. That's not how that worked. The way that this worked, the way that modern naval combat worked, was we were reaching a point where naval guns and naval weaponry was so strong, was so powerful, that we could hit a ship that we couldn't even see. That if you knew its location, you could take a shell and lob it so far that you wouldn't even be able to see it hit. So there was a lot of other technology available to the Japanese and the Russians, but we'll get to that later. That is important, kind of like this, the Tsushima Strait. Moving on. So, one of the most important parts when we talk about the Russo-Japanese War is we talk about the control of the seas.
Why is the control of the seas important?
That's a very good question, Billy. Trent, moving along, that control of the seas was very important because at this point the Russians were having a very hard time getting troops and supplies for their battles against the Japanese here in the Korean Peninsula. Both the armies and the navies of both countries had been fighting each other for about a year, but the Russians were just having such a difficult time getting supplies and men to refresh what they were losing to the Japanese. And let me tell you, the Japanese were absolutely fanatical about the way they fought their battles. Fanatical. Like, we have to take that ridge, let's throw men at it. We need to take that city, let's throw men at it. That's the way the Japanese conducted their fights. Stop. Let's start talking about battles of the Japanese Navy. Let me tell you, there were some epic...
Get to the point, man.
Oh! The Japanese won. Let me tell you how. You see this thing that I've been talking about for a while, right? So, I'm going to take this right here. So, the Japanese had successfully chased the Russians out of Port Arthur by 1905. So, at this point, the Japanese were doing their best to make sure that the Russian fleet did not get back to their base at Vladivostok. The most important thing for the Japanese was to achieve total victory. It was more about respect for them than it was diplomacy. Diplomacy was not something they were looking to do here. They wanted to completely decimate the Russian fleet to send a message. So, how did they achieve this? I will show you. So, this very important place here, right? This is the Tsushima Straits, right here. So, what they did was the Japanese admiral decided this would be a fantastic place for us to catch the Russian Navy, to finally end them. So what they did is the Japanese Navy trapped the Russians in this strait right here and completely and totally destroyed their fleet. We're talking there was very little left of the Russian fleet. There were something of 30 ships that had been destroyed by the Japanese with very minimal losses. So that ended the war, right then and there. So you may be asking yourself at this point, James, what happened after the Battle of Tsushima Straits?
Oi! Tell us about Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, Teddy, TR. Listen, we gotta talk about my man TR. Okay, so if you were two Asian powers that were fighting over land and had a dispute over who should get a port, who would you call? Who would you ask? Let me tell you. They'd ask Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy. So anyway, Teddy decided, hey, listen, we're going to get all these guys from Asia, right? These two powers that have been fighting for a year now. And we're just going to take them all, and we're going to ship them all to Maine, right? So, I don't know why Maine. Maine seems like a pretty nice place, but, I mean, Japan, Russia, that's a pretty long trip. Anyway, moving on. So, Teddy Roosevelt sat the Japanese delegates down and the Russian delegates down, and they pounded out a treaty. And what they decided to do was pretty much give it to the Japanese. So, at this point in time, the Japanese had gotten Port Arthur and most of the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, as Trent would say, what was that word? Oh man.
Imperialism.
Yes, the Japanese did imperialism.
Yep.
So, if you were a European power that had just been beaten by a fledgling Asian power, what would you do?
I'd give them all flowers and tell them to go home.
That's very nice of you. Well, to be honest with you, the Europeans started to respect the Japanese a little bit. The importance of this conflict really can't be understated. This was one of the absolute first modern naval conflicts. When we say modern, we talk about, this wasn't just like really small fledgling ironsides that you hear about in like the Civil War or some other conflicts around the world in the 1800s. This was a conflict that was fought in a modern capacity. You had ships that could hit something a long way away. This conflict also marked the very first use of radio. It was actually instrumental for the Japanese in the defeat of the Russians in the Battle of the Tsushima Straits. So, following this battle, following this war, the Japanese were incensed. They were ready. They were an imperial nation. They had gotten something that other nations had only dreamed about. Other nations had really strived to become something accepted by the rest of the world. And one of the greatest ways to do that, one of the most important ways to get respect from the developed world, I don't really feel that's the right term, from the Western world at that point in time, was to become an imperial power, was to take land, was to show that you were not just isolated to this island right here. This was not the only thing that they were capable of controlling, that they could control this entire sphere. Everything that you see on this map would eventually, at some point, come under Japanese control.
In conclusion,
this was one of the most important conflicts of the 1900s.
and it was also a defining moment for the Imperial Japanese forces.
It would actually come to define Japan's foreign policy for the next 40 years up until 1945, but I think that's a story for another day.
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you.